Good morning. Okay. Good morning. Welcome to the second of two Einspruch lectures for this year. We have some of you here this morning who were at the lecture yesterday, I see, so that speaks well of the speaker, Dr. Stacy Gallin. By the way, I'm David Patterson with the Ackerman Center. Dr. Stacy Gallin is founder and director of the Benjamin Ferencz Institute for Ethics, Human Rights, and Holocaust. She also is the founder of Athletes Against Anti-Semitism and Discrimination, which she established in July 2023 as a way of empowering athletes to use their platform. Many youngsters look to athletes for role models, and I think it's a great idea to bring them into this conversation. She's a regular contributor for the Globe Post, the Times of Israel, Forbes Media, where she writes and speaks about issues on ethics, law, public policy, and human rights through the lens of the Holocaust. Dr. Gallin co-edited a very important volume, a book called Bioethics and the Holocaust, a comprehensive study in how the Holocaust continues to shape the ethics of health, medicine, and human rights. It's available through open access, published in the summer of 2022. It's an incredible resource in this area, this growing area of concern. This is published in partnership with the USC Shoah Foundation, and between the Ferencz Institute and the Shoah Foundation. Dr. Gallin also teaches international course on ethics, human rights, and the Holocaust through the Global Network for Medical Health Professions and Bioethics Education, of which she is the co-chair of education. So we're very honored and blessed to have such an insightful scholar. If you were here yesterday to hear her lecture, you know Dr. Gallin knows a lot and has a lot to offer to us. So please welcome Dr. Stacy Gallin.
All right, good morning, everyone. Nice to see you. Thanks for coming out on this very windy day. I apologize for bringing this rain and storm. There's been no rain in New Jersey since September, so sorry about that. That's my fault. Hopefully it passes quickly. Okay, so it's an honor to be here. Thank you so much. I apologize to people sitting over there. Feel free to move if you can't see me. My giant head is not going to be on the screen the whole time, so if you can't see me and you'd like to, feel free to move. It is an honor to be here. I think that, and I said this last night, the Ackerman Center is doing such wonderful things. I have the privilege of being able to speak at a lot of different universities, a lot of different centers and museums, and I can tell you that unfortunately what we're seeing right now in the world is a lack of knowledge about the Holocaust and a lack of knowledge about the relevance of the Holocaust and why it's so important to keep talking about this event and its significance for the world that we live in today. So the fact that there is a lecture series such as this one, the fact that there is a center like this one is so important, and I really feel privileged and honored to be here. So thank you very much. Let me just, as I said, start with that. Okay, so today we're going to talk about medicine and morality, which is a bit of a continuation from what we spoke about last night, but we're going to go a little bit further today, and we're going to tell the story. We are going to tell the story of how the Holocaust happened. I mentioned this last night. I am Jewish. I grew up in a household where we were fairly religious. I went to Hebrew school 3 times a week, and I never understood actually how things happened. Embarrassingly, I just kind of thought that Hitler woke up one day and said, let's kill all the Jews, and everyone went, okay. But that's not what happened. And it's really, really important to understand what happened if we want to make sure that it doesn't happen again. So I'm going to start with this slide. Every human being has equal value, okay? The hope is that this is the starting point, I would say, for all people, but definitely for those entering the field of healthcare. Okay, at least I would like to believe that that is the case. This belief should be at the core of society and health professional ethics. But under the Nazi regime, this belief was replaced with a hierarchy of human life, with the idea that some people were valued more than others based on their worth to society, and that some people weren't worthy of living at all. So people were labeled as physically, mentally, or racially inferior based on scientific or medical evidence. And that's really troubling, because doctors are supposed to be the people that you go to help. They're supposed to be the helpers. So if they're the ones that are doing this, if they're the ones that are involved in every single aspect of the labeling, the persecution, the classification, and the eventual mass murder of millions of innocent people, we have a serious problem. We have a serious problem when we think about how we get from point A, every human being has equal value, to science and medicine being involved in every aspect of this medically sanctioned genocide. This idea that science and medicine and public health were responsible for the justification of the labeling, classification, persecution, and eventual mass murder of millions of innocent people. So that is the question that we're going to explore today. How did that happen? Before we get to the facts, because I would stress in this presentation, as I would in any presentation, that facts are incredibly important, right? Something in society that I would just want to put out there as being really important. We first have to dispel some of the myths, okay? And these are very common myths when we talk about Nazi doctors. Why do these myths persist? Because it's easier to believe them than it is to actually do the work to understand what really happened. Okay, so incompetence, right? These doctors didn't know what they were doing. They weren't actually well educated. We know that's not the case, okay? We know that the German medical profession was among the best in the world at the time. Madness, right? When Doctors Went Mad happens to be actually the name of one of the seminal books in the field by Arthur Kaplan. I recommend it. They didn't go mad. It's not what happened, okay? This was all part of a systematic transformation. They weren't coerced. We know that most who participated in Nazi medicine did so because they genuinely believed it was the right thing to do. They voluntarily did it. They joined the Nazi profession more quickly and in larger numbers than any other profession. Lack of ethics. Nope. Germany had mandatory ethics classes in their medical curriculum. No other country had that at the time. Or a few bad apples. It was just a couple of doctors. Most people are familiar with Joseph Mengele. He gets brought up a lot, right? But it wasn't just Joseph Mengele, okay? So how do we reconcile these facts, not the myths? How do we reconcile the facts with the Hippocratic tradition and our understanding of the role of healthcare professionals? That is the big question. Okay, so one of my colleagues by the name of Matt Winia, he was interviewed by the American Medical Association last year, and he said the following: "It's important to know this history and not just see it as these are monsters. They did something that's inconceivable. No one I know could ever do that. Seeing the path all the way from here to there is vital, because it's early on this path when you have the greatest opportunity to say, as a community of professionals, we won't do that? It's just like with children, right? When do you have the greatest chance to shape their education? When they're young. It's the same thing. When do you have the greatest opportunity to make a difference in people's education? At the beginning. And then he went on to say, we will never know what would have happened if the German medical community had said no. We will not kill disabled people. That's not what we do. Because that's how it started. And we're going to talk about that in a second. It started with the killing of disabled children. So if the German community, the German medical community had stood up and said no, maybe history would have changed. Maybe things would have been different. Okay. When I say I am going to speak about Nazi doctors and the Holocaust, I'm actually going to ask this as a question, if you don't mind. A little interactive session. I know it's early. How many of you assumed that this talk was going to be mostly about Joseph Mengele and medical experimentation? Couple? Yeah? Okay. That's what happens most of the time. Because when you think about Nazi doctors, you think medical experimentation. That is the number one thing that is associated with Nazi doctors and Nazi medicine. But it's so much more. The story goes so much deeper. And to be honest with you, that's what drew me in, because there's so much more relevance, right? It's not just about medical experimentation, and it didn't just start with the Jews. It started with the killing of mentally and physically disabled children. It started with the scientific idea that some lives were more valuable than others, and when it came time for doctors to act on these ideas, they didn't stand up and speak out. They didn't stand up and speak out to protect vulnerable members of society who needed their protection. Andrew Ivy was a doctor who testified for the prosecution in the doctor's trial. And he said this quote. He said, had the profession taken a strong stand against the mass killing of sick Germans, and when he says sick Germans, he's talking about physically and mentally disabled, it is conceivable that the entire idea and technique of death factories for genocide would not have materialized. Maybe if they had, then what came next would never have transpired. Because it started with the killing of sick, disabled people. And then those ideas transferred over. It was the same ideas, the same personnel, the same equipment, the same techniques that carried over from the euthanasia program, the killing of sick Germans, to the death camps. So his point is that there is an inherent ethical responsibility on the part of the profession. It comes along with being a doctor. And the doctors didn't do that. And if they had, imagine what might have been different. And that, as we spoke about last night, is what led to the birth of modern bioethics and the creation of the Nuremberg Code. That is the reason why, after the Holocaust, the doctors were put on trial. Because it was the doctors who failed. It was the doctors who failed to uphold their ethical responsibility. So the doctors let these ideas permeate. The doctors took these ideas and they used them for the exact opposite of what medicine is supposed to be doing. Okay, so when we talk about the value of bioethics and the Holocaust for medical education, or I would argue, for moral education, okay? We need to understand the story. We need to understand how doctors who took an oath to heal transformed into killers during the day and then went home and tucked their children into bed at night. How does that happen? We need to understand how they sat in rooms not unlike the one that we're sitting in right now, And they listened to ethics lectures as part of a mandatory curriculum, and yet they believed it was morally permissible to kill disabled children. How does that happen? We need to understand the story, because it wasn't something that just happened. Like I said, it wasn't like one day Hitler woke up and said, let's kill all the Jews, and everyone went, okay. That's not what happened. And then we need to seek out the relevance. Why are we talking about this now? Why is it so important to understand? We need to know, what is it about the unique confluence of events in Nazi Germany that allowed this to happen? Because I'm not trying to say that, there's going to be another Holocaust. I don't want to freak everybody out. But there are also certain moral vulnerabilities that are present in the medical profession, and honestly, moral vulnerabilities that are present in human beings that make people susceptible. And the reason behind that is to prevent this from happening again, not in the same way that it happened once before, but in the little ways, right? In the little ways that vulnerable populations are susceptible to systems of power, and in the way that we see anti-Semitism rising. What are we doing about that, and what can we do about that? So that's why we need to have these conversations. That's the reason. And then we need to reinforce what, in my opinion, is the most important lesson of all. So if, let's just say, you leave here and you forget everything that I said, okay? You came to last night's lecture, came to today's lecture, it's 6 months from now, you forget everything that you learned. I hope you remember one point, okay? And that is the following: the absolute necessity of asking questions, okay? If something doesn't feel right, I cannot overstate how essential it is to keep questioning. Do you have a question? Wow, that was like a plant. I didn't even do that. Go ahead.
I have a question, and it's just that I don't remember, and I don't know what did I miss in history, that disabled children were the first.
We're going to get there. Don't worry. Okay. We're going to cover it. So you asked the question. Excellent. Like I said, I didn't put anyone there to do that, but that was well done. We're going to get there, I promise. And the rain comes down. It's a very dramatic effect. Okay, so as long as it is done respectfully, okay, and that's important to understand, right? As long as it's done respectfully, which is something that as a society we may have forgotten. As long as it's done respectfully, it's not only your right, but it is your responsibility to ask questions, because questioning prevents complacency. It encourages accountability, it builds knowledge and moral character. Questioning keeps everyone honest and transparent and prevents the abuse of power, mistrust, and distrust. Okay? Keep asking questions. I'm just going to say it one more time to drive it home. Keep asking questions. So, okay. The scientific theory of eugenics, we have Nazi, which is what we're transitioning over to now, right? Then we're going to talk about some of the actual facts behind this, and we're going to get into the answer to your question. Nazi health programs were portrayed as population health interventions. So that's important, right? Because how do you get everyone to kind of go along with this idea? How do you get everybody to say, okay, this makes sense? So population health interventions were based on medical ethics, which are part of this medical education curriculum that I was talking about earlier. Germany was one of the first countries to have a mandatory course in medical ethics. And the key principle here to understand is the view that Germany was a living, breathing organism with its own health and hygiene, okay? So if you're a doctor, your job typically would be to care for the individual being a breathing organism with its own health and hygiene. But that idea was kind of manipulated in Nazi Germany, and the role of the physician became to care for the Volk, to care for the nation of Germany, which was a living, breathing organism with its own health and hygiene. And individual rights were subverted in favor of societal progress. Individuals were seen as parts of a whole, parts of the Volk, and they were productive members of society only if they could benefit the Volk. So the job of the doctor was to care for the individuals only insofar as they could benefit the Volk. If they could not benefit the Volk, then they no longer were seen as productive members of society, and there was no point in caring for them. This was the medical ethic that was taught as part of this medical ethics curriculum. So it's not that there was no ethics, it's that it was a different, twisted version of ethics. This shift, this paradigm shift from caring for the individual to caring for society is the single most important shift in medical ethics that we all need to understand. It is very much responsible for how the doctors did what they did. Because it's not just what they were told to do, but it's what was taught to them. It's what was ingrained in them. It's what they were told was their job. Their job was to care for a breathing organism with its own health and hygiene, but that breathing organism was not the individual, it was the state of Germany.
How were the directives to make these changes came down? How did, you said rewrite the ethics, how did that happen?
I'm gonna ask you to hold that thought because it's coming up. But again, great job with the questioning. If I still don't answer the questions, ask them again. Okay, so great that medicine is doing that. Where's this coming from, okay? So there's a rise in international eugenics that's based on this idea, the scientific theory of eugenics becomes the justification for sterilization to create a better society. Now, where is this coming from, you may ask? So eugenics is a term coined around 1880 by British scientist Francis Galton as a way to further evolution, especially that of our human race. This photo that you see here is a very famous photo. It is very large, but in case you can't read it, it says, eugenics is the self-direction of human evolution. And this tree here, this eugenics tree, is basically talking about the roots. Those are the roots of human evolution, okay? So, fun party fact, in case anyone ever finds themselves at a loss for something to discuss. Galton was Darwin's cousin, right? And sometimes eugenics gets talked about as social Darwinism, right? The idea that survival of the fittest, that all kind of came from this. It actually really wasn't where Darwin was going with this, so I imagine that those family reunions might have been a little tense. But the idea here is that the scientific theory, the idea is there's an international movement to use science to counter this degeneration that's happening. It doesn't start with Germany. Okay? It starts, yes, with Britain, but mostly with the United States. Okay? That is where Germany is looking, because the United States is really doubling down on this. And you can see March 9th, 1907, Indiana approves the first eugenic sterilization in the US, making sterilization mandatory for direct quote, by the way, criminals, idiots, rapists, and imbeciles in state custody, okay? The idea here is if the tools existed to create a better society, why wouldn't science and medicine use them? Okay, so you've got a bunch of people that are out there, okay? Poor nutrition, alcoholism, sexually transmitted diseases, immigration, the mixing of races. They're creating a society that is not up to the standards of what people want to see. Degeneration of society. How do we stop that? Well, wait, maybe science and medicine can help by sterilizing these people to make sure that they don't reproduce. And the Supreme Court is behind this in the United States. So you've got a quote from Oliver Wendell Holmes, who says 3 generations of idiots is enough, when the Supreme Court passes a law that allows for this to happen. So it's backed up. It's not just like people are just, yep, let's do this, and it's some crazy doctors, again, a few bad apples or medicine going mad. This seems to people at the time like a legitimate public health measure. Australia, South Africa, Central Europe, they're all utilizing eugenics as a way to build their nations, to make them strong, to ensure that the nation building process is going the way they want it to go. The problem is, science can provide the justification, but they need medicine to practically apply it. The law can back it up, right? But they need medicine to practically apply it, and that's where medicine comes in. Now, one could argue, right, medicine should be protecting the individual, but as we said before, in this instance, medicine is looking more at this as a public health, what is in the best interest of the public. And it happens first, as I said, in the US. So by the time it gets over to Germany, there's a pretty strong foundation for saying, well, other countries are doing it, so why don't we? What happens in Germany, though, is it turns into racial hygiene, right? It's an offshoot of eugenics, and National Socialism is on the rise. So National Socialism picks up on this, and Hitler picks up on the idea that physicians can be used, and physicians can, their status can be raised, and National Socialism becomes known as applied biology. We're gonna take biology, and we're gonna use it, and we're gonna apply it to the bettering of the entire nation. So Germany needs to be purged of any non-Aryan, genetically and racially, okay, inferior elements that were infecting the Volk. So notice the language that starts to come in here, okay? Notice the medicalized language, infecting the Volk. What do you do when something is infecting your body? You get rid of it. Depending on what it is, you get rid of it by any means necessary. So what do you do when something is infecting the body politic? What do you do when something is infecting the nation? The doctors become the biological soldiers. Not my term, this is the term that's being used in Nazi Germany. They get rid of it by any means necessary. And there's a ton of quotes that talk about that talk about Jews are a cancer that's infecting the nation, and they would cut it out the same way you would cut out cancer, or the same way you would cut out a gangrenous appendix, okay? So here we have, because people have different value to society, based on their biological or genetic composition, they should be treated like that. You start seeing the politicization of medicine. You start seeing the political goals and the medical and biological goals combining. So these systems of power are sending the message that certain people were worth more to society than others based on an accepted scientific theory. And now you start to understand what I didn't when I was in Hebrew school. Now you start to understand how all this is coming together to target marginalized people. And you start to understand, okay, because it's not just it's science, it's medicine, it's law, it's politics, but it's also the media, right? It's in textbooks, it's in children's textbooks, it's magazines, it's everywhere, because we all know, right, the propaganda machine, very famous. It's everywhere. It's infecting, I use the word infecting again, it's infecting every aspect of daily life. So yeah, people are buying this, because if science and medicine say it, it must be true. Law's backing it up. So what happens? Okay, now we've got the law, right, which is a partial answer to your question. The law for the prevention of hereditarily diseased offspring, okay? So now we're forcing sterilization on eugenic grounds for schizophrenia, manic depressive illness, epilepsy, Huntington's disease, hereditary blindness and deafness, severe hereditary physical deformity, severe alcoholism, and congenital feeble-mindedness. You may ask, what is congenital feeble-mindedness? Which would be a great question. It's anything that falls under the category of being unfit, as deemed unfit by the leaders of the Nazi Party. 50 to 60% of all sterilizations fell under that category. Then you have the anti-black racial policy, okay? Forced sterilization of 600 to 800 children born to white mothers and non-white fathers from the French colonies who had served as soldiers during World War I. Did not fit into Hitler's version of what society should look like. Okay, so now we're medicalizing race. So we're medicalizing pretty much anything that doesn't fit into this view of what society is supposed to look like. June 26, 1935, men found guilty of sexual activity with other men were castrated to avoid further incarceration. So now we're medicalizing homosexuality. Science provided the justification for the creation of public health programs to address societal problems: poverty, prostitution, crime, drugs, spread of sexually transmitted disease. These people were considered asocial. So, we've medicalized race, homosexuality, social problems. All these people get separated out because they're not considered part of what the Nazis want society to look like. And obviously, the Nazis don't want them reproducing, okay? This is not what the fit look like. This is not what the future is supposed to look like. And so, okay, Germany's taking care of the future. The Nazis have taken care of that, but what about the present? How do they take care of the present? And this is the big split, right? This is the split between Nazi Germany and the United States or Britain or any of those other countries that we talked about that Hitler had looked to for examples, or for inspiration, I should say. Most of the world stopped short of these drastic measures. Germany shifted over to euthanasia. So, the euthanasia program started about 2 years before the Nazis began systematically murdering Europe's Jews as part of the final solution. The idea here was to eliminate life unworthy of life. Individuals who were believed to pose both a genetic and a financial threat to Germany because of severe psychiatric, neurological, or physical disabilities. Here's the answer to your question. August 18th, 1939, all physicians, nurses, and midwives were required to report children under the age of 3 who showed signs of severe mental or physical disability to the Reich Ministry of the Interior. October 1939, specially recruited medical staff began murdering children by lethal overdoses of medication or by starvation. At least 10,000 children were ultimately killed. This is how it started, with the Children's Euthanasia Program. I'm gonna say it again. It started with the killing of disabled children. It did not start with the killing of the Jews. So when we talk about why it is relevant to discuss the Holocaust, this is why it's relevant. Because physicians who took an oath to heal, to preserve human life, to care for the sick, for the vulnerable, for marginalized communities, transformed into people who believed it was okay to murder disabled children. And that then morphed into adult euthanasia. So when we talk about adult euthanasia, okay, the program was expanded to include adults whose disabilities left them unable to work. They were life unworthy of life because they were a financial burden to society. There are plenty of advertisements. There are plenty of things you can look at in textbooks where they are used as math problems. This person cost society this many Reich marks. This is how many Reich marks a normal, healthy family costs Germany. What is the difference? These are used as word problems, teaching children. Okay? The reason that they were able to then move on to the final solution is because of the success of the adult euthanasia program. Success was deemed, the word success was used because they were able to kill these people, because Victor Brock, who was the head of the Chancellery's Department T4 program, which was named T4 because of the address of where the program resided, because they did such a good job. Because they did such a good job of eliminating people who were unworthy of life, who were posing not just a genetic threat, because the genetic threat you can get rid of by sterilization, but a financial threat. They were taking up beds in hospitals that could have gone to wounded soldiers. An estimated 250,000 people were murdered under all phases of the euthanasia program. That's just the euthanasia program. That's not what most people think of when they think of the Holocaust. That's before, okay, that's the 6 euthanasia centers, okay, there were 6 of them. I've seen them, they're very troubling, and they look a lot like the rooms that were then used in the death camps. Why? Because they worked. So they transferred all of the materials, all of the personnel, as I said, the equipment, the people, they just picked them up and they moved them. One led to another. The idea led to a bigger idea because it worked. So again, let's go back to Ivy's quote. If the doctors had not said the syringe belongs in the hand of the physician, but if the doctors had said something else, like, hey, wait a minute, I don't think we should be doing this. This doesn't feel right. Or ask some questions. Maybe we would not have then been talking about 250,000 people being murdered as part of the euthanasia program, or 6 million people being murdered as part of the Holocaust. Maybe we would be having a different conversation. So then the question becomes, how could this happen? So, things to remember. Okay. You always have to be careful and respectful in using the Nazi analogy. Okay, I personally am a firm believer that we need to talk about this because there are important lessons that we need to draw from it. I am not trying to say that any of the things that are happening today are the same, okay? I'm not trying, the purpose is different. Anything that happens today, any of the bioethical debates that are taking place today, we can learn things. We should have conversations, but the purpose is not the same, okay? There was a unique confluence of events. There were things that were happening that are not what is happening today. But that doesn't mean that we can't learn things from the Holocaust. And in order to, those of you who were there last night, I've spoken to survivors. I've made promises to continue to tell their stories. We need to continue to tell the stories. We need to continue to learn the lessons. But purpose matters, right? There are different purposes for the things that are happening now. And you can see this Godwin's law. Godwin said that the length of an internet discussion, as an internet discussion continues, the probability of referring to someone as a Nazi increases, okay? We see this a lot, and we saw it a lot, obviously, particularly when people are having political discussions, right? Like, you can't just start calling people Nazis. You don't want to overuse it. When you overuse it, you are not being respectful. You are belittling what took place, okay? The Holocaust should be revered, it should be sanctified, but we should also learn from it. But what you see on the right is a plaque that is in Auschwitz, and it says those who do not remember the past are condemned to repeat it. So we have a responsibility to talk about what happened and to learn from what happened, but to do it in a respectful way. Someone's taking pictures. I'm just gonna give it a second before I move on. You good? Okay. Okay, so, yes.
So the Nazis are pretty well known for record keeping.
That is correct.
Are there records of like, this is how much money we saved by doing this program?
I mean, are there records? Yes. Are they always accurate? No, because they're yes, well known for record keeping, but also well known for propaganda. So, you know, I would always go back, and this I think is also something that we can, you know, compare to today. You know, you always want to make sure that what you're looking at is accurate. So I would stress fact checking. Okay, so when we're talking about factors unique to the early 20th century, there are medical factors and there are political factors. Medicine at that time became very institutionalized. And a lot of this had to just do with science at the time and what was happening with science. So the focus on the production of scientific knowledge was really important at the time, and there was an emphasis on biological, genetic, and genetic factors as opposed to social and emotional. The Nazis weren't really big on that. They weren't really, as you can imagine, really big on, oh yeah, let's you know, get to the real core of what people are thinking and feeling. So the laboratory revolution, right? Shifting the focus from the patient as an individual to the patient as a research subject to be studied, that does go back to the idea of medical experimentation. So the division of labor, I discussed this last night, the division of labor led to less human interaction with the patient. This was something that was taking place already, but the Nazis were really good at making sure that physicians in concentration camps did not interact with the same prisoners several days in a row, because then they would develop a relationship. And if they developed any type of emotional tie with the prisoners, it would have been much more difficult to do what needed to be done. So when you look at political factors, there was, as we said, the rise of international eugenic theory and National Socialism as applied biology. Medicalization was used as an answer for societal problems. And we see this, as we talked about before, we see this in the United States. We see this in Britain. We're seeing this all over. This was not specific. You can see on factors unique to the earliest 20th century. This was not unique to Germany. This was just something that was happening at the time. But it was enhanced, let's say, in Nazi Germany. National Socialism prioritized the collective interests of society over the individual, okay? That was something that was unique, and the advancement of science placed over the health of the individual. One of the things about the concentration camps and the medical experimentation, so in Germany, you know, we started seeing in the occupied territories, Jews were expelled, right? So a lot of Jews had held important positions in science and medicine. So the doctors then, there were young doctors who were able to take advantage of that in terms of their careers. So that career advancement allowed them to then look at certain experiments that they may not have otherwise been able to do. And this advancement of science really was very rapid because there were opportunities that otherwise might not have existed. And physicians became agents of the state. So when I mentioned before, you know, biological soldiers, that was very real. The idea that they were because the relationship was so enmeshed, they were doing things as representatives and agents of the state. So what we see here is that the history of bioethics in the Holocaust proves that our core values, right, both as a society and within healthcare, are fragile. We can't just assume that everyone has this set of ethical values that reside in us, and no matter what happens, they're going to stay constant. They're fragile, and they need to be constantly reevaluated, reinforced, and protected. We need to keep having conversations like this. We need to keep checking in because outside influences continue to affect ethics and society. So medicine and ethics definitely Wow, sorry about that. I don't know what happened with that second bullet point. Medicine and ethics don't exist in a vacuum. We like to think that they do because we like to think that medicine is sacred and that it's always going to kind of have this goal of protecting the individual. But what we saw with the Holocaust is that that's not the case. So in Nazi Germany, medical ethics were manipulated into a tool of the state and used as the foundation to advance a racist, eugenic agenda that ultimately led to the murder of millions. And that is frightening. That is incredibly frightening when you think about it like that. It is ultimately more frightening than little, 7-year-old Stacy in Hebrew school thinking, well, Hitler woke up one day and said, kill all the Jews, and everyone said, okay. So we have to remain committed to protecting the health, well-being, and human dignity of all individuals. The big question, right? Just because we can, does that mean we should? We have the technology to do certain things. That's what happened with eugenics. People said, well, if we can create a better society, doesn't that mean that we should? Like, why wouldn't we? But technology is advancing at such a rapid rate, we're going to have the ability to do a lot more. Just because we can, does that mean that we should? Just because things are ethical, does that make them legal? Things were legal in Nazi Germany, didn't make them ethical, okay? Ultimately, we have to remember to respect and protect the individual. And that goes back to, and these are the things that I'm gonna leave you with here, the idea of moral vulnerabilities of physicians. So we talked about the unique aspect of the time. But what about the moral vulnerabilities of physicians that still exist? The idea of hierarchy, right? You do what your superior tells you without question. Very similar to the military, right? Even if it feels wrong. So Nazi biological soldiers. So when is conscientious objection permissible or required? When do you go against what your superior is telling you? Right? If you're a resident, if you're a medical student, and your superior tells you to do something, you do it. But what does that set you up for? License to Sin. This happens to be my favorite one because I think it's a really cool sounding name, right? Like I feel like it's like a Bond movie. It might be a Bond movie, actually. I don't know. So if a physician cuts off a person's leg to save her life in the OR, that's heroic. But a civilian cutting off someone's leg randomly in the grocery store is illegal. So there's this great power, like physicians get drunk on power. There's a great power that comes with that white coat. That's why they do white coat ceremonies. They have them put this coat on to understand you have a power. You have the power to save lives, but you also have the power to take away life, okay? That's a tremendous responsibility. And I realize that I'm quoting from Spider-Man here, but yeah, like with great power comes great responsibility. That's a thing. All right, just because it's Spider-Man doesn't mean it's not true. People need to understand that, right? You have to, that is a huge responsibility. The power to give life, the power to take life, and that, abusing that power, understanding that white coat ceremony is very real, but it's also something that the one quick ceremony isn't enough. There needs to be this type of a conversation to really, really drill that home. Inflicting pain. So being a doctor means causing transient pain for the patient's benefit. Okay, so I take my kid every year to get a flu shot, and he cries. And he's like, please don't make me do it. I'm like, right, but ultimately it's gonna protect you. So you cause transient pain, in some cases, in the form of diagnosis and treatment, and it's in keeping with the bioethical principles of autonomy and beneficence. In Nazi Germany, becoming comfortable inflicting pain to achieve benefit for the Volk, right, not for the individual, but for the greater good, without consent or concern for the individual was a crucial step in that transformation from healer to torturer. Okay, so are there current situations in which this may happen? Maybe a research ethics type of thing, right? We need to think about that Because again, we need to understand, are there situations where, I'm not saying, again, this is gonna happen on a grand scale, but there are things that we need to look at on smaller levels to understand and to make sure that there's a system of checks and balances. Clinical detachment. It's necessary to show empathy and care, but you also have to remain detached enough to prevent burnout, okay? And still remain capable of performing one's duties. If, doctors in certain specialties, it's very difficult. How do you do it, right? How do you go in every day if you're an oncologist and you have to deal with something, so difficult? It requires a certain amount of dehumanization. But one physician who worked at Auschwitz said, in the beginning, it was almost impossible. Afterwards, it became almost routine. So how do you balance the dehumanization with the care and concern? Because medicalization and dehumanization are the two terms that I would use to really define how this transformation took place, from healer to killer. And then we have medical terminology and euphemism. So physicians and researchers often remove any evidence of humanity from verbal or written proceedings for the purpose of clarity, privacy, and standardization. So they talk, the schizophrenic or exam room 4, but that damages the doctor-patient relationship. In its most extreme form, language can be used to sanitize and medicalize procedures to cover up illicit activities. So instead of stating that they murdered disabled children, Nazi doctors said they euthanized life unworthy of life. They were cleansing, they were disinfecting the German stock by sending them for special treatment. So again, it's about finding this balance, because there are certain things about the medical profession that inherently kind of set them up for these moral vulnerabilities. And the most important thing is the doctor-patient relationship and building that trust. So by teaching these topics, we understand the importance of building trust, we understand the importance of ethics, we understand the importance of that moral compass. We understand the importance of needing to develop that so that it can guide us. And that's really, again, the relevance of teaching this topic. Not because it's solely history, not because, it's something horrible that happened to the Jewish people, but because we can learn from it. And you can see all of the current implications. It's not something that doesn't matter anymore. It's something that has so much relevance. These are just what would fit on the page. There's a ton of other areas that this applies to. I'm leaving it up for picture purposes. I'm almost done, and I'll let you ask. I think one more slide. Okay, so ultimately, in a post-Holocaust world in which political, economic, and social forces are increasingly encroaching on moral decision-making within medicine, we have to use the Holocaust as the historical framework to build a new paradigm that emphasizes rehumanization and human dignity. You have to allow the physician to ask questions if something doesn't seem right, to respectfully disagree, to stand up and speak out against injustice or discrimination of any kind and in any form without fear of penalty or backlash. Only then will the health and well-being of both the patient and the physician, because it's very important that we're talking about both, be respected and protected. Every voice matters. Every action matters. Every question matters. So I came all the way from New Jersey to Texas. Okay, I gave you all this information. So my only request of you as you leave here is to think about, what will you do, right? What will you do to make a difference? Because we could all make a difference. It doesn't have to be some grand gesture. It's just to be something. Because the world needs us. The world needs us to take these lessons and use them, right? So, as I said, my only request of you is to just think about what you can do and what you will do to make a difference. That's it for me. I'm more than happy I'm more than happy to answer any questions. I would be a hypocrite if I didn't. Yep.
You could go back about 4 of them, but the one that had like 1, 2, and 3 was the one right before that. I just didn't get a picture.
Last night you talked about catastrophic ethics.
Yes.
Could you put into perspective the 1 through 5 in the catastrophic ethics perspective? Does that make sense? What
The
I'm
moral
asking?
vulnerabilities of physicians, is that what you're asking about?
Yes.
In catastrophic ethics?
Yes. Because it seems to me like the entire regime was a catastrophic ethic possibility. So if you could just take just a short minute and your last 5, the moral vulnerabilities of the positions put in the catastrophic ethics perspective.
Like today, in terms of catastrophic ethics, or how? Can you clarify the question?
How these 5 things fit into the catastrophic ethics at the time.
Yes. Okay.
And put it into like a nutshell.
Yes. Okay. So I think that in terms of ethics, when you have all of these moral vulnerabilities, make it very easy to throw ethical principles out the window, because ultimately, I'm trying to think of the best way to answer this question. No. You're good. Questions are, as I said, encouraged. So, in a system of catastrophic ethics, like we saw in Nazi Germany, you don't have the ability to question anything, right? Things come down, and you're told what this new system of ethics is going to be, and the leaders are they're creating a new form of ethics, catastrophe ethics, and then it becomes a hierarchy where this is what it is, right? This is the ethics that we're dealing with. So the younger generation is not going to question it, so that takes care of hierarchy, right? So the younger generation is not going to question it because the militarization of medicine in Nazi Germany was very strong. And this idea of the new ethics, I would say, in Nazi Germany allowed the doctors to advance their career. You had guinea pigs at your disposal in concentration camps. So inflicting pain, all of these things, the license to sin, were seen as opportunities under the ethics of the time, because the ethics of the time were advance the Volk, right? Scientific advancement at all costs. So the license to sin, the idea of inflicting pain, all these things, nothing mattered as long as you were working towards the greater good. So it was, at that point, a different type of ethics, and everything was twisted. So the moral vulnerabilities, you were playing into these moral vulnerabilities because you were giving a different form of ethics. And all of these things just played into it because doctors were elevated to a different stature. So it didn't make a difference what they did. The license to sin, inflicting pain, all of these things were just part of their job, or just part of their responsibility for the greater good. So I would say the catastrophe ethics at that point was actually their system of ethics, if that makes sense.
So would you say that the system of ethics would be the greater good, the catastrophic part of it is the greater good?
Yes.
Okay, so going back to the Holocaust.
Yes.
I understand that it started off with eugenics and the killing of disabled children because after all that was better for the state. But I think that Hitler realized he could expand it to the Jews as much as anything, because as a result of the Wannsee Conference, when he realized that nobody cared.
Right. So this paved the way.
He could do what he wanted, have medical experiments, kill them, because nobody cared.
If nobody cares about the killing of disabled children, nobody's going to care about killing the Jews. He paved the way, right? So when the doctors didn't stand up and speak out when disabled children were killed, when nobody stood up and spoke out after the euthanasia program, when that was successful, that's, I think, really when Hitler was able, that was, in its own way, an experiment, right? That's when he was able to say, okay, now we can expand it. Now we can expand it, and the idea of putting Jews, incorporating Jews into this, well, they're also infecting the Volk. They're also infecting the Volk because they are a racial threat. That was a lot easier to do once he had kind of already tested it. And so that's why they were able to take all of the ideas, all of the personnel, all of that, and that is how they were able to do it on such a grand scale, because they had already done everything. They had already done all the legwork. They had already done all of the for lack of a better way to say it, the PR. And so they took it and they transferred it and they put it on a much larger scale.
But I think it also, like I said, depended on the fact with the disabled people, that's just within Germany. That's just people in Germany not caring. But what he realized with the Jews was that the world didn't care.
Right.
And therefore, no other country was going to do anything about it because they didn't care about them, because we're not real people.
Right. Well, the idea, again, right, of the dehumanization, and at that point also, I think the war had also gotten to the point where everything had expanded, everything kind of had gone his way, from a military perspective also. So the combination of all of those factors, when we talk about the confluence of events, it was a perfect storm that allowed things to work out in such a way that the final solution was kind of a natural next step for him to be able to do this. And then also he expanded the killing. So euthanasia was done with, in the disabled population, euthanasia was done, I'm very sorry for the way I'm going to phrase this. I'm phrasing it the way that it would, I'm using the words that would have been used at that time. It was not done in the most efficient manner. By the time he moved on to the final solution, there was a much more efficient method for killing the Jews.
Were there any families who didn't want to give up their disabled children, that snuck them out of Germany, that resisted at all?
Well, so it's a great question. Yes, but that's why I said once you add it as public health law, that's when it gets really scary, because it's public health law, then you don't really have a choice. There were people, so letters went out after it wasn't well known that they were killing children by starvation and that they were killing them for these specific reasons. They were told that they were, being sent places where they were going to take care of them. And then they would get a letter that said, your son died of a burst appendix. And then someone would say, well, my son had his appendix removed already. And that obviously threw up some red flags. But it's a machine, all of the Nazi, eventually, it got to the point where it was so large and there were so many systems of power involved. Fighting the machine is not easy. Fighting the machine, honestly, fighting any type of bureaucracy is not easy, but at that point it really wasn't easy because, as I said, it seeped into every single aspect. So, one family says something, two families say something, it's very difficult to go against that.
So I have a corollary to that. I'm thinking that in the 1920s and 30s and 40s and even 50s, even in our country here, if you had a child with severe disabilities, they were not raised at home. They
Right.
were sent somewhere. And so if something happened to them, you really didn't know until you got the letter.
Right.
I mean, I had a schizophrenic brother, and it was in the 1960s. And he lives somewhere else. And we didn't have, now I'll go to modern day, we didn't have until lately, right, in the last 30 years, so many places and avenues for people with disabilities. I can think of so many nonprofits that their whole existence is to protect and provide for people with disabilities. And there was nothing like that back then, that those people were hidden.
Right.
You were ashamed to have those people, and even your marriage prospects. It was like, don't tell anybody that we had that child, because, you know, so Hitler could really kill people. And I think for the families, those folks they were shut away anyway, and it's a loss, but you know, it was a way to get away with it,
Right.
easily.
Yep.
So I have a quick statement and then a question. So the statement is like, if you said no, the Gestapo was gonna come get you. So it was like, well, do I save myself and my family,
Right.
or worry about the stranger family? And then my question was like, was the elderly population worried about this if they didn't work? What was, you know, how are they helping? Like, in their words, not mine.
That's a very good question. So I don't think, you know what, it's a great question. I don't 100% know the answer to that until it comes to the concentration camps, where, you know, obviously the elderly population, when they were on the selection ramps, were automatically sent to die. I don't know how easy, all right, this is just my opinion. I don't know the actual answer, and I actually am now intrigued, and we'll have to look into it. But I would assume that it would be more difficult to say, oh, we're gonna, you know, send the elderly people, you know, unless it was a nursing home. You know, I'm not really sure. I don't know. It's a very good question. Anybody else?
I just think, looking at today versus then, the pro-life movement in Germany, it seemed like the pro-life was to help the existing population get rid of the people they didn't want, right? And now the pro-life movement is you preserve all life from a certain, you know, early starting point. It's just something, it's such a white and black contrast.
So what they actually had was, if you were a healthy Aryan woman, you were not allowed to get an abortion. There was, but if you were considered to be genetically unfit, then you were sterilized. There were better, like fitter families and better babies contests. So if you had over a certain amount of kids, you were given like a medal, because you were doing your part to, you know, ensure the health and well-being of the Volk. So it went both ways. There was, I mean, definitely every single thing about reproduction was controlled by the government in a very calculated manner.
Sure. What, if any, is the correlation in the research of collaborative doctors in the occupied territories as far as meeting these same standards as were set out by the German law?
If you were under the Third Reich, this is what you were doing. Because this is what you were told to be doing. This is what was, this is basically what you were, this is the ethic. This was the Nazi medical ethic. So, you know, to the extent that you were practicing medicine under the Third Reich, this is the way that you were practicing medicine, if that answers your question.